Rhaella Targaryen, the mother of Daenerys Targaryen, and the wife of Aerys the Mad King Targaryen, and the mother of Rhaegar, friend of Joanna Lannister. That's the topic for today, Rhaella Targaryen. I'll call this House of the Undying Part 2, because it is really a follow-up to that. So last time, I offered an interpretation of the House of the Undying visions, the first 5, that suggested that our interpretation of all 5 of those visions was wrong, where our wrongness in every case was that we assumed that the powerful men were evil, even though we don't know enough about those situations to say that for sure. And I might have left you wondering, what do you mean we're not sure that the Mad King was evil? He's the Mad King! Of course the Mad King was evil. We know all kinds of evil deeds that he did. He tried to burn down King's Landing. He tried to kill Ned Stark and Robert. Tortured and killed Ned's father and brother. Everybody who remembers him as the Mad King. His name is incited throughout the whole story as a warning against being a bad king and going mad. What in the world are you talking about, Apples and Dragons? So in this episode, I'm going to address that. But as we just described, that's a challenge that is so broad and all-encompassing that it won't be possible for me to persuade you that we're wrong about the Mad King without great effort. And so that persuasion is a feat that's beyond the scope of this video or any single video. And last time I also said that there's another mystery about Rhaella Targaryen reaching into the House of the Undying vision, where the 4 dwarves are attacking the woman's breasts, because Rhaella Targaryen suffered the same attack from her husband, the Mad King. In episode 16, I talked a bit about the justice themes in A Song of Ice and Fire, because one of the things A Song of Ice and Fire is deeply about is justice, and that your average person doesn't really understand the principles that underlie how justice is done. And then in episode 17, I joked about one of those principles, pointing out that Maester Yandel, who wrote The World of Ice and Fire, tries to make the reader feel like Aegon IV the Unworthy is guilty of the crime of poisoning his father in order to get the throne, by referring to his guilt in other areas, as if the answer to the question of whether or not a person did bad thing D is in any way influenced by whether he did bad thing C, B, or A. And so this is one of the principles that underlie our justice system. It's the idea that each individual crime deserves its own individual trial. But human beings are reputational creatures, and we're naturally ready to assume that a person is guilty of one thing if we think he's already guilty of other things. And that effect is at work on us when it comes to the guilt of Aegon IV the Unworthy and Aerys the Mad King. Aerys II the Mad King. I won't be doing Aegon IV in this episode, but I do have an Aegon IV series that you can watch if you want that. The Mad King is our subject today, because Rhaella Targaryen is our topic today, and the Mad King was her husband. And throughout the series, we get little tidbits about their relationship, not much. If I remember right, Rhaella Targaryen fled the Red Keep with baby Viserys and baby Daenerys to Dragonstone shortly before the sack of King's Landing. And that was probably a good idea. Elia Martell and her children Rhaenys and Aegon were not so lucky, and we saw how things turned out for them. So, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the least and 10 being the most, how evil would you say is the Mad King, Aerys II Targaryen? And I mean the version of Aerys at the beginning of Robert's Rebellion. Post-Defiance of Duskendale. That's the event where we're told that his madness began. So we're talking post-Tywin Lannister drama. Tywin Lannister was his Hand of the King, and he was so good at the job that people started saying that Tywin was the real ruler of the kingdoms. And Aerys really didn't like that. And it drove a wedge between them. And then Aerys started doing some nasty things to Tywin, but in a really crappy bureaucratic sort of way, where Tywin can't say anything about it. He just has to bite his tongue. I guess this would also be the version of Aerys where
he had stashed wildfire all around King's Landing in case he needs to burn it all up. So that seems really evil too. So whatever score you gave him, I'm going to give him a 10.
Let's say the Mad King was 10 out of 10 evil. That seems like a safe score, especially considering his reputation in the present day story.
So like I said, I don't think I'll be able to persuade you that he was anything less than a 5 evil in one video. But if I do my job right, I think I can knock that number down to a 9 or an 8 before I'm done here. And cause you to seriously question what you think you know about the history of Robert's Rebellion and the Mad King and all the other people involved.
So, it starts with a feast for crows, I do believe. That's where I'm going to start. A feast for crows. In case it wasn't obvious already, spoilers for everything in A Song of Ice and Fire. So in A Feast for Crows, Jaime 2, page 232, that's when we get the story about the Mad King attacking his wife Rhaella Targaryen. So I'm going to read that. Jaime sees Cersei crying, and it says, "She is crying," Jaime had realized. But whether it was from grief or ecstasy, he could not have said. The sight had filled him with disquiet, reminding him of Aerys Targaryen, and the way a burning would arouse him. A king has no secrets from his Kingsguard. Relations between Aerys and his queen had been strained during the last years of his reign. They slept apart and did their best to avoid each other during the waking hours. But whenever Aerys gave a man to the flames, Queen Rhaella would have a visitor in the night. The day he burned his mace and dagger hand, Jaime and Jon Darry had stood at guard outside her bedchamber, whilst the king took his pleasure. "You're hurting me," they had heard Rhaella cry through the oaken door. "You're hurting me!" In some queer way, that had been worse than Lord Chelstead's screaming. "We are sworn to protect her as well," Jaime had finally been driven to say. "We are," Darry allowed, but not from him. Jaime had only seen Rhaella once after that, the morning of the day she left for Dragonstone. The queen had been cloaked and hooded as she climbed inside the royal wheelhouse that would take her down Aegon's High Hill to the waiting ship. But he heard her maids whispering after she was gone. They said the queen looked as if some beast had savaged her, clawing at her thighs and chewing on her breasts. A crowned beast, Jaime knew. By the end, the Mad King had become so fearful that he would allow no blade in his presence, save for the swords his Kingsguard wore. His beard was matted and unwashed, his hair a silver-gold tangle that reached his waist, his fingernails cracked yellow claws 9 inches long. Yet still the blades tormented him, the ones he could never escape, the blades of the Iron Throne. His arms and legs were always covered with scabs and half-healed cuts. So that is a pretty good glimpse into Aerys and Rhaella's marriage at the end of his reign. And it's pretty ugly. They are not sleeping together. They don't get along. They avoid each other when they're awake. That is the only time you can avoid someone. Thank you, Ned. And Aerys apparently gets some kind of sexual gratification from watching people burn. And that's why Cersei was crying. She was watching the Tower of the Hand burn, I think it was. Yep. So Jaime saw something in Cersei that he didn't like, and it reminded him of something he saw in Aerys long before. It says, whenever Aerys gave a man to the flames, Queen Rhaella would have a visitor in the night. So it aroused him so much that he would have to go and basically relieve himself on his wife, which May or may not have been rape, but the possibility is certainly there. It says the day he burned his mace in a dagger hand, Jaime and Jon Darry had stood at guard outside her bedchamber whilst the king took his pleasure. So Jaime and Jon Darry were standing guard outside of Queen Rhaella's bedchamber, while King Aerys basically was raping her inside, or hurting her or something. And it makes Jaime very uncomfortable, because of course it does, and he wants to do something about it. He wants to go in there and protect her. But when he speaks up about it, Jon Darry basically tells him not to. Jaime said, "We are sworn to protect her as well." And Darry said, "We are, but not from him." And so Darry's point there was that he's the king. You can't defy him. He's the absolute authority. And your job as the king's guard is to obey him. And so if the king wants to take his pleasure from his queen, it's not our place to stop him. And then on the morning of the day she left for Dragonstone, as she was getting into the wheelhouse, and her servants were whispering that the queen looked as if some beast had savaged her, clawing at her thighs and chewing on her breasts. And that's when Jaime knew that the beast was no beast. It was the king. A crowned beast, Jaime knew, because he was there to hear it himself. And then we get a paragraph about how crazy the Mad King was. He was so paranoid about blades that he wouldn't cut his hair or fingernails. And he was covered in scabs because the one blades he couldn't avoid were the ones on the throne that he's required to sit on. The throne cutting the monarch is, in Westeros, considered a bad omen, or a sign that it's a bad king. And so that matches with Aerys being a bad king. Alright. So that's the main scene I'm going to be talking about today. And in the last episode, I said that that scene is connected to the House of the Undying scene through the breast violence. The teeth to breast violence. So I'll reread that real quick, just as a refresher. Dany could hear sounds within the walls, a faint scurrying and scrabbling that made her think of rats. Drogon heard them too. His head moved as he followed the sounds, and when they stopped, he gave an angry scream. Other sounds, even more disturbing, came through some of the closed doors. One shook and thumped, as if someone were trying to break through. From another came a dissonant piping that made the dragon lash his tail wildly from side to side. Dany hurried quickly past. Not all the doors were closed. "I will not look," Dany told herself, but the temptation was too strong. In one room, a beautiful woman sprawled naked on the floor, while 4 little men crawled over her. They had radish pointed faces and tiny pink hands, like the servitor who had brought her the glass of shade. One was pumping between her thighs. Another savaged her breasts, worrying at the nipples with his wet red mouth, tearing and chewing. Yeah, I don't like reading that passage any more than you like listening to it. So, but there it is. We have to handle it. So let's do it. So last episode, I did what I called theme analysis, where I looked at all of the visions of the House of the Undying, at least in this first section of it, and I tried to find something they all have in common, and that's what I call a theme. It's one idea that unifies all of the things, however many things there are. I'm going to do theme analysis again on these 2 scenes that we just read. The one with Jaime remembering the Mad King assaulting Rhaella, and the one at the House of the Undying, where Dany sees the 4 little dwarves savaging the woman. And I'm going to establish right now, the one idea that unifies these 2 scenes is teeth doing violence to breasts. Let's put it that way. Because that's present in both scenes. And it might seem like an arbitrary thing to unify anything, but that's kind of the beauty of theme analysis. It's that by following seemingly arbitrary commonalities, you can discover some extremely important and meaningful things about the story that you maybe could have found another way, but would have been more difficult and taken longer. A Song of Ice and Fire is a ginormous series, isn't it? So how many scenes in A Song of Ice and Fire would you guess have that quality? Teeth doing violence to breasts. In any capacity. Well, even though this is a really big series, that's such a specific thing. The possibility that there are more than 2 scenes that have something like that in it seems pretty low. But as I'm sure you've guessed by now, there is another scene that has that quality in it. In fact, there are at least 2 more that I know of. So let's read those, and once we have all 4 of the scenes of teeth doing violence to breasts, we'll compare them to see if we can find another thing that they all have in common. So in A Clash of Kings, turn to page 609, if you have the same copy. And let's look at the chapter Theon 4. Theon 4 is basically the worst day of Theon's life. Something like that. Theon has taken Winterfell, but it's not going so good. And he took a big chance sending Ramsay away, because Ramsay promised to find a bunch of men for him. And Theon's prospects were so bad that he was like, hey, what else do I got to lose? Let me send Ramsay out. Maybe this nobody will come back with somebody. And of course, he doesn't know this is Ramsay. He thinks this is Reek. And Theon's having terrible nightmares. And he feels guilty about killing the 2 kids. The Crofters boys or whatever. And we're getting to see Theon going through his own episode of madness here. So I'm going to start reading in the middle of one of his nightmares. Along the walls, figures half seen moved through the shadows, pale shades with long grim faces. The sight of them sent fear shivering through Theon sharp as a knife. And then the tall doors opened with a crash, and a freezing gale blew down the hall, and Robb came walking out of the night. Grey wind stalked beside him, eyes burning, and man and wolf alike bled from 100 savage wounds. Theon woke with a scream, startling Wex so badly that the boy ran naked from the room. When his guards burst in with drawn swords, he ordered them to bring him the maester. By the time Luwin arrived, rumpled and sleepy, a cup of wine had steadied Theon's hands, and he was feeling ashamed of his panic. A dream, he muttered. That was all it was. It meant nothing. Nothing, Luwin agreed solemnly. He left a sleeping draught, but Theon poured it down the privy shaft the moment he was gone. Luwin was a man as well as a maester, and the man had no love for him. He wants me to sleep, yes, to sleep and never wake. He'd like that as much as Ashel would. He sent for Kyra, kicked shut the door, climbed on top of her, and fucked the wench with a fury he'd never known was in him. By the time he finished, she was sobbing, her neck and breasts covered with bruises and bite marks. Theon shoved her from the bed and threw her a blanket. Get out. Yet even then, he could not sleep. So there's Theon's scene of teeth doing violence to breasts. The breasts belong to Kyra. I think she's a common tavern girl or something from the town outside Winterfell. She's 18. And so Theon is apparently trying to use sex to cope with his desperate situation. Sort of relieve some stress, take out his anger, and poor Kyra's on the wrong end of it. So that's scene 3 of teeth doing breasts to violence in A Song of Ice and Fire. I guess I should number them chronologically. The House of the Undying Ones is scene 1. This Theon scene is scene 2. The Jaime scene is scene 3. And the next one will be scene 4. The Feast for Crows, Brienne 6, page 466. So in this chapter, Brienne and Marybald and Podrick and the gang are arriving at the Quiet Isle to meet Elder Brother, and they have a long conversation with him. They pass the Gravedigger, who's almost certainly the Hound. They talk about Rhaegar's rubies. He turns to Septon Marybald. I hope that you have time to absolve us of our sins. Since the raiders slew old Septon Bennet, we have had no one to hear confession." "I shall make time," said Marybald. "Though I hope you have some better sins than the last time I came through." Dog barked. You see, even Dog was bored. Podrick Payne was puzzled. "I thought no one could talk." "Well, not no one, the brothers. The other brothers, not you." "We are allowed to break silence when confessing," said the elder brother. "It is hard to speak of sin with signs and nods." "Did they burn the sept at Salt Pans?" asked Hyle Hunt. The smile vanished. "They burned everything at Salt Pans, save the castle. Only that was made of stone, though it had as well been made of soot for all the good it did the town. It fell to me to treat some of the survivors. The fisher folk brought them across the bay to me after the flames had gone out, and they deemed it safe to land. One poor woman had been raped 12 times, and her breasts. My lady, you wear man's mail, so I shall not spare you these horrors. Her breasts had been torn and chewed and eaten, as if by some cruel beast. I did what I could for her, though that was little enough. As she lay dying, her worst curses were not for the men who had raped her, nor the monster who devoured her living flesh, but for Sir Quincy Cox, who barred his gates when the outlaws entered the town, and sat safe behind stone walls as his people screamed and died." "Sir Quincy is an old man," said Septon Marybald gently. "His sons and good sons are far away or dead. His grandsons are still boys, and he has 2 daughters. What could he have done, one man against so many?" "He could have tried," Brienne thought. "He could have died. Old or young, a true knight is sworn to protect those who are weaker than himself, or die in the attempt." "True words, and wise," the elder brother said to Septon Marybald. "When you cross to Salt Pans, no doubt Sir Quincy will ask you for forgiveness. I am glad that you are here to give it. I could not." He put aside the driftwood cup and stood. So there it is. That's all 4 scenes that I know of with teeth doing violence to breasts. Now, before you start thinking this is some weird fetish of mine, I'm going somewhere with this, I swear. Since it's so specific of a thing, it seems at least a little unlikely that there would be 4 scenes in A Song of Ice and Fire with that going on. And so if the commonality is arbitrary, then I would not expect to find a second commonality across all 4 of those scenes. And if there were a second commonality across all 4 of those scenes, it would seem even more unlikely. But yeah, that's the challenge. If you want to pause here and reread these for yourself and think about it for as long as you need to, now's a good time to do it, because I'm about to tell the answer. These 4 scenes of teeth doing violence to breasts have another thing in common besides teeth doing violence to breasts. And that thing is, there's a closed door. Incredible, right? Wow, there's a closed door. Mind-blowing. What are you getting at, you might be wondering. Or you might already see exactly where this is going. So just to do my diligence, I'm going to reread the lines, short form this time, of the door in all 4 of these scenes. Start with the House of the Undying. We'll go in storytelling order here. Daenerys, House of the Undying. Other sounds, even more disturbing, came through some of the closed doors. One shook and thumped, as if someone were trying to break through. From another came a dissonant piping that made the dragon lash his tail wildly from side to side. So there's 2 closed doors there, and as I hope I demonstrated in the last episode, those turned out to be the most important thing that Dany saw in the House of the Undying. Because the answers to the questions of what's behind those doors is what allowed us to unify all of the other visions that follow. Behind the shaking and thumping door is the monsters of the world, so those are weak men and people who hate life and goodness. And behind the other door is a dissonant piping, which represents a dissonance or problem in the relationship between men and women. Because piping means it's an instrument. So the questions are, what instrument and what song is it playing or trying to play? And the first song that should come to mind, because we're reading A Song of Ice and Fire, is The Song of Ice and Fire. Scene 2. Clash Theon 4. He sent for Kyra, kicked shut the door, climbed on top of her, and fucked the wench with a fury he'd never known was in him. By the time he finished, she was sobbing, her neck and breasts covered with bruises and bite marks. He kicked shut the door. A Feast for Crows, Jaime 2. They said the queen looked as if some beast had savaged her, clawing at her thighs and chewing on her breasts. A crowned beast, Jaime knew. And A Feast for Crows, Brienne 6. One poor woman had been raped 12 times, and her breasts. My lady, you wear man's mail, so I shall not spare you these horrors. Her breasts had been torn and chewed and eaten, as if by some cruel beast. I did what I could for her, though that was little enough. As she lay dying, her worst curses were not for the men who had raped her, nor the monster who devoured her living flesh, but for Sir Quincy Cox, who barred his gates when the outlaws entered the town and sat safe behind stone walls as his people screamed and died. In that one, the door is barred gates. But barred gates are pretty much synonymous with a closed door. So, there's all the closed doors. Now let's turn back to Jaime 2 and revisit the scene about Rhaella. The day he burned his mace and dagger hand, Jaime and John Darry had stood at guard outside her bedchamber, whilst the king took his pleasure. "You're hurting me," they had heard Rhaella cry through the oaken door. "You're hurting me!" In some queer way, that had been worse than Lord Chelstead's screaming. "We are sworn to protect her as well," Jaime had finally been driven to say. "We are," Darry allowed, "but not from him." Jaime had only seen Rhaella once after that, the morning of the day she left for Dragonstone. The queen had been cloaked and hooded as she climbed inside the royal wheelhouse that would take her down Aegon's high hill to the waiting ship. But he heard her maids whispering after she was gone. They said the queen looked as if some beast had savaged her, clawing at her thighs and chewing on her breasts. A crowned beast, Jaime knew. So, the question is, why are all of the scenes that contain teeth doing violence to breasts referring to a closed door? It really tarnishes your opinion of John Darry, doesn't it? I'd hate to imagine that I would do the same thing in John Darry's position. Hearing a woman being raped and brutalized and just not doing anything about it, and even telling my partner not to do anything about it, the other guard, just because I'm afraid of the consequences of interrupting the king's rape or contradicting the king. I think even if I knew that it might end in my death, I might just intervene anyway and count it worth the risk. And when you consider that John Darry was one of Rhaegar's closest companions, and that Rhaella is Rhaegar's mother, and that there's every reason to assume that Rhaegar and Rhaella were close, doesn't it seem kind of weird that John Darry doesn't feel like he needs to intervene to protect the mother of his good friend and prince, regardless that she's the wife of the king? Surely John Darry's clout with Rhaegar could earn him some mercy from the king if the intervention doesn't work. And surely there are ways to intervene without being too violent. Simply opening the door and stepping in might be enough to stop the king from brutalizing her. Well, consider this. Might it be possible that John Darry knows something about the situation that Jaime doesn't know? I mean, Jaime is new to the Kingsguard. He was only made a Kingsguard recently, at the tourney at Harrenhal. But Jon Darry has been a Kingsguard for a good while. So it's possible that the reason Jon Darry is telling Jaime to stand down has to do with his greater knowledge of the situation, and the social dynamics of the king and the queen, and everybody there in the Red Keep. As a Kingsguard, he's as much a permanent resident in the Red Keep as the royal family are. Well, I've danced around it enough. So here's the answer to the Rhaella mystery. The reason all of the scenes in A Song of Ice and Fire that contain teeth doing violence to breasts are referring us to a closed door is because the door in the scene with Rhaella Targaryen being savaged by the Mad King was also closed. And because it was closed, Rhaella was faking. As Jaime's memory shows us, the news of the bruises and the teeth marks that Jaime hears about comes from Rhaella's servants. It says he heard her maids whispering after she was gone. They said the queen looked as if some beast had savaged her, clawing at her thighs and chewing on her breasts. And as Jaime's memory shows us, Jaime never saw the bruises and teeth marks himself, because, quote, Jaime had only seen Rhaella once after that, and, quote, the queen had been cloaked and hooded as she climbed inside the royal wheelhouse. So she was fully covered, and there was no way for Jaime to see whether she had bruises. The news of the bruises comes from Rhaella's servants, who, I should point out, are under Rhaella's control. Rhaella's maids are going to say whatever Rhaella tells them to say, in front of whoever Rhaella tells them to say it in front of. So with this revelation, we're able to reread Rhaella's you're hurting me" lines, and I have a little bit of an easier time seeing how disingenuous those words sound, coming from someone who's supposedly being hit and bitten and raped. It's almost as if she's narrating what's going on behind the closed door for the guards that she knows are standing outside. And the reason Jon Darry told Jaime to stand down is because Jon Darry is familiar with the king and queen's relationship, having served in the Red Keep for a while now. Most probably, Rhaella has done this sort of thing before, and most probably, Aerys II Targaryen, the Mad King's own wife, was conspiring against him to make him seem like the bad guy in his own castle. And if Rhaella's willing to fake a savage rape and beating, just to incriminate her husband in the minds of any observers, I have to start wondering what other lies and performances Rhaella Targaryen may have perpetrated during the reign of the supposedly Mad King, and the year of Robert's rebellion. However mad the Mad King was in truth, his madness makes a little more sense, now that I know that his own wife was conspiring against him, and telling horrendous lies about him, and that apparently there was no boundary to the sorts of lies she's willing to tell, and perform with her body and voice, for anyone who cares to hear it. Anyway, guys, I think that's going to do it for the Rhaella episode. This story's amazing. I hope you got something out of it, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.